Goodness me. So, where to begin? Right. Harry Potter. Really important. Everyone likes it. Defined a generation. However, I've noticed a critical lack of hot takes on Harry Potter. When was the last time you heard an opinion on Harry Potter that actually made you reevaluate the series? For my part, as somebody who likes to watch a lot of these movie hot takes, the answer to that question is never. So yeah, this is a hot take. You can tell because I've arrogantly titled this Harry Potter but better. That might make it sound like this is going to be some kind of fan fiction reimagining belated media style, and while there will be the odd comment about how the series could be improved, in reality, this is just going to be a pretty standard review. So why should you care about my opinion? Well, because I have actually changed people's minds on this topic before. I've encountered a lot of people who have the wrong opinion on Harry Potter, and I've put them right. Maybe you also have the wrong opinion, so you should watch this review. So here's my opinion, straight up. Each Harry Potter film can be assessed by looking at how compelling the plot of each individual film is, plus looking at how that film contributes to the overarching story of the franchise. After evaluating all the Harry Potter films with this methodology, I've come to one inescapable conclusion. The first 3 films are really good, while every subsequent film has been varying shades of not good. And with the 2 Fantastic Beasts films coming out, the Wizarding world is now perfectly mirroring the Star Wars world. 3 really good films, 7 pretty bad films. And yes, I will be reviewing the Star Wars films at some point too. Before I really dive into this, I want to defend against a few objections a lot of people have to the first 3 films. Complaint number 1. The CGI is bad. Well, yeah. The CGI gets better pretty much with each film because that's how technology works. However, the quality of effects doesn't determine the quality of the story. Ray Harryhausen has been involved in some timeless action-adventure films, and they're timeless despite the fact that by nobody's standards is his work photorealistic. There's this weird double standard we have where when it comes to practical effects, people give it credit for being good for the time, but when it comes to bad CGI, people act as if it's a serious flaw. It isn't. If the story is good, the effects don't matter. Complaint number 2, the acting is bad. I find this one funny because do the people who make these criticisms think that the acting improves? There's some awkward delivery in the first few films, but there's also awkward delivery much later on too. If anything, it's worse in the later films, because the dialogue itself is supposed to be more dramatic and impactful, so the awkward delivery hurts the quality a lot more. Honestly though, I kind of feel the same way about acting as I do about special effects. Special effects are how you make something seem realistic, even though it's fake. The same can be said of acting, yet when CGI is a bit off, we can still appreciate the quality of the film, so I'd argue we should treat acting the same way. The only time bad acting really hurts a film is when the delivery of the line matters a lot, because it's supposed to be really dramatic. But as I already said, that only really happens in the later films. Number 3. The later films are darker. If this is your reasoning, I'm going to have to break something to you. Disliking fun films doesn't make you cool. There seems to be this idea that films that are darker, tonally, are more adult, and therefore more sophisticated, and therefore better. Personally, I think crafting a compelling narrative that doesn't rely on needlessly dark plot points is a lot more sophisticated than just killing off major characters left, right, and centre to make the film seem meaningful. The dark defense is what allows people to argue that Revenge of the Sith is better than Return of the Jedi, because Jedi has Ewoks while Revenge has infanticide. It's the same as arguing that DC films are better than Marvel, because Marvel films are fun films for the family, and that makes them bad, while DC films are dark and violent and gritty, and that makes them good. It's such obviously awful logic, and yet this is probably the number one reason I hear given for why people prefer the later films over the earlier films. It's dumb. One final thing before I get into the review. I can anticipate some people claiming that the reason I think the films start off good and then get worse is because I just became more cynical over time. This isn't true at all. When The Goblet of Fire came out, I still thought that the Star Wars prequels were good films. I was young enough to not really have any conception of what made a good film, and for that reason I enjoyed The Goblet of Fire. Yes, by the time the last few films were coming out, I had become quite cynical in general, But the divide between good film and bad film in this review is not just based on nostalgia versus cynicism. I am still nostalgic for The Goblet of Fire, and even a bit for The Order of the Phoenix, but I just don't think those films hold up in hindsight, whereas the first three films do. And on that note, let's take a look at the first film. So just to recap what I said only a few minutes ago, I'm going to be assessing every Harry Potter film based on two criteria: the quality of the standalone story for each film, and then the way that story impacts the overall plot of the series. And if you want to start somewhere, the simplest and most effective question would be, what is this film about? And the film answers that question for you in the title. It's about the Philosopher's Stone. So let's look at that briefly. It takes until around the 25-minute mark before the Philosopher's Stone actually enters into the film, when Hagrid goes to Gringotts Bank. 25 minutes in might seem a bit late, but actually, it can be worth leaving the main driver of your plot absent for the first half of the first act or so, especially in stories that are much more about the protagonist than they are about the plot. Something that the Philosopher's Stone does really well is mystery. Not every plot for every film has to be a mystery, but mysteries are often the most engaging stories. See, even though we know the film is called The Philosopher's Stone, it takes a fair while before this mysterious package is ever referred to by name.
The Philosopher's Stone. The what?
Instead, up until this point, it is referred to in vague terms, and its significance is only hinted at. It's in an incredibly secure vault, telling us that it is important. Hagrid is very reluctant to acknowledge the importance of the package, telling us that it is important. Somebody breaks into Gringotts not long after the stone is withdrawn, telling us that it is important. Speaking of importance, Dumbledore says that the third floor is strictly off limits for anyone who doesn't want to die a painful death. This, of course, sets up the gang accidentally ending up on the third floor and encountering Fluffy. Note also that they end up finding Fluffy because they are running away from Filch, not because they're just being stupid. Anyway, Hermione ascertains that Fluffy must be guarding something. The film at this point hasn't told us much at all in terms of details, but we now have a clear idea that there is something important on the third floor, and we're invested in finding out what it is. After this, we get the scene with the troll in the dungeon. In a lesser film, this would just be a random action scene to keep the audience interested. But since the troll's release is revealed to be a distraction, we know it relates to the main plot. Side note, Ron saves Hermione by using the very same spell that Hermione earlier chastised him for not being able to use correctly. This is using a neat story trick called clever writing. I do have one little criticism of this scene though.
I went looking for the troll. I read about them and thought I could handle it.
Why does Hermione pretend that she went to the bathroom to confront the troll? She could easily have just said she was in the bathroom because sometimes people have to use the bathroom. Anyway, speaking of scenes that could easily have been pointless filler, we have a Quidditch match. And again, this action scene has a purpose by advancing the narrative that Harry's life is in danger and somebody is trying to kill him. This is enough evidence for the gang to conclude that somebody is trying to steal something. Again, we still don't know what it is, but we're heavily invested in finding out. So they interrogate Hagrid. A generally good rule for exposition is this: when characters are eager to provide expository dialogue, it's kind of boring. When characters are reluctant to provide important information, we're automatically more invested. This is why scenes like this work so much better than scenes like this.
It's just bewitched to look like the night sky. I read about it in Hogwarts, a history.
Fortunately, that latter clip is an irrelevant aside, while this much better scene is dealing with information integral to the plot. By the end of this scene, we have only a name to think about: Nicholas Flamel. Some time passes and we get a line informing us that they've been looking for information on Nicholas Flamel regularly.
We've looked 100 times.
However, Hermione tasks them over Christmas to look in the restricted section, which is made a lot easier when Harry is given an invisibility cloak for Christmas. While exploring, he witnesses a confrontation between Professor Snape and Quirrell, where Snape says some things which would imply he is the bad guy. 50 minutes left to go in the film, and we finally have a name for our mystery object, the Philosopher's Stone, with which somebody can create the elixir of life and become immortal. The gang goes to see Hagrid, but while speaking to him, they get caught out late at night, and as punishment are forced to go out late at night. Rather stupidly, two 11-year-olds are sent off on their own when there is something capable of killing unicorns around. They of course encounter this something, which they conclude must be Voldemort, trying to sustain his life force, and he is almost certainly after the Philosopher's Stone. We then learn from Hagrid that the person who gave him his dragon wanted to know about Fluffy, which would be very useful
I shouldn't have told you that.
when stealing the Philosopher's Stone. This leads to the final confrontation, where our heroes must solve a bunch of challenges, inexplicably not jump off of horses, and then finally, HP himself confronts Voldemort, and predictably, Voldemort is defeated. Also, twist, Quirrell was the bad guy. All in all, I'd rate the storytelling of the Philosopher's Stone a 10 out of 10. The protagonists are active, the characters are engaging, and pretty much every scene feels necessary. Every scene advances the plot just the right amount, telling us enough to keep us interested, but leaving us enough to be discovered that we're still invested. The pacing in particular is fantastic. Now it's time to talk about how this film advances the overarching plot of the series. Of course, this film, as with all first installments to a franchise, has an obvious advantage. It is pretty much inescapably necessary. There is only one example I can think of where the first installment of a franchise contributes almost nothing to an overarching story, Star Wars: The Phantom Menace. And even then, that's only the first installment by numbering, not by release date. Anyway, remember how I said that the main plot of this film starts at the 25-minute mark? That's because up until this point, we're establishing Harry, and it's a real blast. His family is just so delightfully hateful, and the way it builds up to Harry finding out he's a wizard just cheers me up. My only real criticism is when Harry says this.
You knew. You knew all along and you never told me.
Of course they knew. They have been trying to keep something secret from you for like 10 minutes now. Pretty obvious there was something important they weren't telling you. There's also some good character stuff within these first few minutes. Dumbledore says he'd trust Hagrid with his life.
I would trust Hagrid with my life.
And then Hagrid gets really angry at Vernon for insulting Dumbledore.
Never insult Albus Dumbledore in front of me.
Showing their mutual friendship and respect. Finally, Harry Potter himself is handled really well. They do a really good job just letting us know that something bad has happened and that Harry Potter is famous for some reason. We share Harry's confusion over why he's considered such a big deal in the wizarding world, which primes us to sharing his pain and sadness when he finds out what happened to his parents at the 30-minute mark. Speaking of which, they are able to use the magic mirror, which turns out to be important to the plot, in order to also drive home just how important Harry's parents are to him. They also begin to establish one of the series' most dynamic elements, the curious connection between Harry Potter and Voldemort, made most obvious here by the fact that Harry's wand is made from a phoenix feather plucked from the same phoenix used to make Voldemort's wand, which killed his parents and gave him his famous scar. There is also one final thing this film offers us to keep us invested. Voldemort is really evil. He wants to kill Harry, and he is trying to come back. He has been defeated this time, but has he been defeated for good? All in all, I'd give The Philosopher's Stone a 9 out of 10 for contribution to the overall story. It introduces a lot of interesting elements. However, a lot of what this film introduces was simply necessary because it was the first film. It wouldn't be fair to give this film credit for introducing Harry Potter, Voldemort, and Hogwarts, because those concepts necessarily had to be introduced. However, I will give the film credit for how well it introduces these elements. Anyway, that's The Philosopher's Stone, and I already know this is going to be the longest installment, so bye, part 2 coming out soon. Like, comment, and subscribe. Love you.